Well, welcome everybody. We're here in Leiden at the Leiden Asia Center under stringent COVID conditions. You're all at home. I hope. And we're doing here a session on China and Russia's approach to cyberspace and its implication for Europe. You are very much invited to ask questions later on. You can do that by using the chat box function, and we will select the questions as they pop up. Now, I will do a very short introduction because the timing seems quite good, actually. As since we speak, Sergei Lavrov is in Beijing meeting his counterpart Wang Yi for bilateral talks, and they have confirmed their mutual ambition for fighting the pandemic and addressing the climate change, but they also use the opportunity to criticize the very recent measures taken, and some still to be taken, by Brussels against Russian and Chinese officials, mostly who are associated with Xinjiang on the one hand and Chechnya on the other hand. Yesterday, Beijing retaliated by publishing a list of EU citizens who will be denied access to the People's Republics of China, provided they wish to obtain visa. It affects a number of members of European Parliament, researchers, and also the Dutch member of Parliament for D66, Sjoerdsma. So this particular geopolitical dimension will surely be addressed during the Q&A session, if not before. Now back to the report. The report, of which you will now receive a link if you hadn't read it before. I would have strongly recommended that you would have read it before because it's no light stuff. The report is written by Rogier Creemers, who is actually here in the room. He's the project leader of our China cybersecurity project and a universitair hoofddocent at the University of Leiden. We do this together with our former colleague Eric Zhang, who is joining us online. Hi, Eric. Very nice that you could make it at this point. And also thanks for contributing so heavily to the report. The report they've written together deals with the perception in many parts of the world, but foremost in the West, that China and Russia, together with Iran and North Korea, are the main culprits on state level when it comes to undermining the very broad concept of cybersecurity, both in private and public sectors. Most cyber attacks around the world are attributed or at least associated with these countries, but very few people are able to distinguish between the lot. And today we will take a better look at two of them. One is the People's Republic of China and also Russia, primarily from the perspective of the latter. So the main question is, to what extent do, either on a government level, semi-government or otherwise, alliances between these two countries undermine our security, our cyber security, and also what can be done about it? I will start off with Rogier, and we will first take a couple of more general questions before we go into the assessment of the report. Rogier, just to give us a feel, how are China and Russia to be compared in terms of cyber power?
Well, it's not always easy to compare them, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, cyber power is obviously a very broad concept that has many components. And two, this is something that has changed rapidly over time. So if you look at it in one area, which is influence or voice in global cyber diplomacy circles, you see that until fairly recently, China was definitely the junior partner to Russia, for instance, in terms of taking initiatives at the UN level. So it was Russia, first and foremost, that came up with ideas on cyber sovereignty in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it's been Russia very much that has put that on the agenda, where China has been very much the junior partner, right? Learning from Russian diplomats how you organize yourself in that space. Russia also developed particular hacking and influencing capabilities long before China did. And particularly when we look at things like psychological operations, active measures, right? The things we saw in the 2016 election in the United States, as well as the Brexit referendum and other forms of disinformation campaigns. Russia is clearly ahead of that in comparison to China. But what Russia does not have, and China does, is a cyber economy. China has, in 2014, declared that it wanted to be a Wangluo Qiangguo in Chinese, and you can dispute the translation, but I tend to translate it as a major cyber power, and that is across the board. So China is increasing its capabilities in a number of sort of associated typically with state actors, military intelligence, surveillance, security capabilities, but it's also building up a digital economy. And by now, I believe that China is second only to the United States, and in some points even ahead of US businesses where it comes to technological capabilities. And that's something that Russia simply does not have. With the exception of Kaspersky, the antivirus company, there really isn't a big internationally operating Russian technology company.
Yeah, definitely. How would you rate Russia if you would compare it to other countries in Asia, like South Korea, Japan?
Well, it's sort of, you could look at various indices, but you know, Russian GDP is about on par with that of South Korea, and it's not even twice the GDP of the Netherlands. So in economic terms, Russia is really small, and a very significant part of its economy obviously deals with resource extraction. Mm-hmm. So what you have is you have uneven capabilities in the industrial realm, which obviously leads to vulnerabilities that in turn lead to some of the Russian asks in the relationship with China, which Eric will be talking about later. But on the other hand, it also means that if where Russia chooses to invest, they're really good. So they're really good and really strong in a small number of things, and have been able to generate disproportional political effect through those. But that doesn't necessarily translate well into other parameters of political or economic strength.
Yeah, okay, clear. Maybe there are some questions in the Q&A, but for now we'll leave it to that. Eric, in spite of what's going on in Beijing right now, Russia and China are known for more or less being adversaries for a long time. And I do recall, although not from personal memory, the long visit from Mao in 1949 to Moscow, where people in China even begin to doubt whether Mao was allowed to return safely at one point. Now, if we look at the more popular views in Russia about China, what would you say are the main trends there?
I think if you look at the public opinion in Russia in regards with China, there are two important things that need to be mentioned. So first, we have to realize that Russia is probably one of the countries that has the most favorable views on China if you compare Russia with the rest of the world. But on the other hand, I think Russia and China, especially at the popular level, they are very different. They're very distant from each other. So they have. It would be fair to say that Russia knows more about the West than how much they know about China, and I think this is also true at the expert level. So because I think if you need to study a specific actor, be that China or Russia, you probably have to be able to speak a language, and those kind of talents is relatively lacking in Russia. And traditionally, sinologists that do engage in policy relevant research would focus more on the economic or political cooperation with China. And at a more popular level, I think it really depends on where you're coming from, what your political views are, and what your level of education is, basically. So, for example, if you are in Siberia, you might be more wary about China's involvement in Russia in terms of whether China truly sees Russia as an equal partner. Instead of just having the intention of exploiting Russia's natural resources for its own good. But if you live in European Russia, this kind of narrative can be relatively lacking. But I'm not saying everyone living in Siberian Russia would think that way, because that would also relate to what your political views are, as I mentioned earlier. So, for example, a person with a more nationalist view would problematize it much more than a person who's more liberal-minded. But I think it would be fair to say that the skepticism in Russia towards China is also growing in recent years, and that can be caused by the growing power symmetry between China and Russia, and the increasing level of China's involvement in Russia. And that all caused concerns in public. And when it comes to cyberspace, I think because Russia, as we will probably talk about it in later stages of this webinar, Russia is also tightening the control of its own internet. And it's difficult for ordinary Russian people not to make that comparison with what China's internet is like today. So that might also play a role.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Back to Rogier. Rogier, given the immense, sometimes hysterical interest around the globe in how China and the US are entangled in a tech war, how does that look from the Sino-Russian perspective, in the sense, well, what is the nature of the bilateral relationship between those two in terms of technology?
Well, it really starts with the fact that these countries sort of start finding themselves not in any sort of joint positive agenda, as in something that they really want to achieve, but in a sort of shared rejection of the techno-optimist idea that starts emanating from the US and the West more broadly in the 2000s, right? This notion that digital technology will confirm the superiority of the Western post-Cold War agenda. So technology will bring liberal democracy everywhere. Technology will bring the free market everywhere, right? I think by now we've become a lot less techno-optimist. But that really was the notion, right? Technology, the export of American technology will lead to the export of American or Western economic and political values. And countries like Russia or China, predictably, weren't quite interested in receiving American or Western political and economic value. They essentially wanted to maintain their own space of action. And this is where the whole cyber sovereignty narrative, the cyber sovereignty story comes from. And that is that idea that technology sort of becomes the tip of the iceberg, symbolizing, on the one hand, that Western belief in the historical inevitability of liberal democracy plus free market capitalism, and China and Russia wanting to resist that at all costs, for starters, because they do not wish to have their regime changed. And that is really where that relationship grows from. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no conflicts or that there are no tensions. China's been spying on the United States, for instance, military companies for military security technology. It has also been spying on the Russians. And so what we've seen is that, you know, that level of distrust that you mentioned earlier, to a certain degree, that still influences matters, right? They see themselves as in the same camp, but particularly when you talk to people at the working level, I mean, it's obvious that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin get through one door very easily. At the working level, it's actually a lot more difficult, although that is also now starting to change. When you actually look at what is happening outside the diplomatic realm, the actual level of cooperation between Russia and China on digital technology affairs is small. It is growing for obvious reasons, but is mostly growing on the Russian side because Russia wants access to Chinese technology, partially for its own political censorship and surveillance purposes, but also, you know, because it's cheaper and not necessarily worse than the alternatives. Whereas what China wants from Russia in the other direction is what it's not getting from the West, which is some sort of recognition, some sort of respect in the technology sphere. And obviously, these countries share a large land border, they share interests in Central Asia. So Moscow and Beijing, they sort of kind of have to be cordial at least. Because they've got so many touch points.
Yeah, I can imagine that in developing common tech products, Eric, I look at you again. The traditional tendency of Russian engineer and Russian tech people to be very, very secretive about technical developments, because that was so much embedded in the history of the Soviet Union. Does that still play a role?
As in, you mean the secretive nature of technology? I think the issue at hand with the in cyberspace when it comes to technology for the Russian side is that they, as we previously mentioned, is that they don't really have a digital economic sector. And apart from the Kaspersky lab, I think there isn't much going on in the development of Russian digital economy. And I think that also plays a role in the bilateral relations when it comes to cooperation in digital economy between China and Russia. And well, of course, this is also related to geopolitics, right? Because Russia sees the world as a multipolar world order in the making, where of course it would be one of the great powers. And but as the growing power symmetry between China and Russia is more and more obvious, I think Russia is also wary about whether they want to be a junior partner in that sort of economic or technological relations, whereas they will be economically and technologically dependent on China.
Okay. Linked to this, of course, the digital Silk Road, whereby China is exporting all kind of digital knowledge, digital infrastructure, etc., around the globe. Is that something that's also being perceived in Russia?
Yeah, I think it's definitely seen both at the expert level and at a popular level in Russia. So the digital Silk Road, and also because Russia has well, a very strong sphere of influence mentality. So what is going on in Central Asia is also often discussed in Russia at a popular level and by Russian experts. So actually, there are a lot of concerns from both sides. I think from China, there are talks about the lack of sustainability and profitability sometimes when they engage in investment in Central Asia and Russia. And as I mentioned from the Russian side, although they would love access to Chinese technologies and digital services, I think at a lesser level they also prefer Chinese digital services than those provided by the West, as it would be easier. Maybe that's perception. It would be easier for the regulatory body to get them to cooperate. But on the other hand, well, as we mentioned, there are concerns about further economic integration with China and where that would put Russia in the bilateral Sino-Russian relationship.
Okay, great, thanks. Rogier, you mentioned already the cyber sovereignty issue. If we look at the regulation of the cyberspace in terms of content, what are the differences in approaches between China on the one hand and Russia?
Well, I'm not sure it's as much a matter of preference as it is a matter of history. Russia still pretends to be a democracy, but also China has been heavily censoring its internet since the early 2000s, right? The standard story is we start getting the Great Firewall in the wake of the Falun Gong crackdown, where then Falun Gong activists start sending content into China from the United States. And this is the point where it is decided to have the Great Firewall of China. And obviously it's been sort of strengthened, expanded, upgraded in the decades since then, which really means that pretty much from the get-go of technological adoption in China, the people who stood ready to generate content for Chinese people were Chinese businesses, right? Either state-owned or private businesses. And that obviously means that the Chinese government doesn't just control the online space through law or regulation. It also means that it has fairly direct control over these companies themselves and what they do. And that puts it in a very powerful position to control content. And obviously, you know, to control that content is very much part of an intellectual tradition within the Communist Party of China, where it really tries to generate, present, and inculcate among the people a meticulously developed, crafted ideological message, right? It is trying to convince its audience of a particular kind of truth. Now, what happens in Russia is, one, Russia doesn't really have its own internet companies, certainly not to the same tune that China does. Yeah. So Russia has to face up to the Facebooks and the Twitters and, you know, the other foreign online service providers of this world, which means its level of control is far lower. Second, Russia pretends to be a democracy and has far less of a history, at least, you know, post-USSR breakup, of maintaining that ideological sphere, right? Vladimir Putin doesn't have a central propaganda department that sits on top of a nationwide propaganda bureaucracy with decades of experience. So the composition of the public sphere is somewhat different. But I think most importantly, I'm not sure that the Putin government believes in a clear and consistent ideological message, right? It is about reflexive control. It's about doing the things that are necessary to keep Vladimir Putin in charge. And if that means nationalism, it will be nationalism. If that means homophobia, it will be homophobia. If it means anti-corruption and sort of getting rid of some of the oligarchs, it'll mean that. But also, if it means that sort of, you know, that range of tactics that, you know, some people have called hyper-normalization, this use of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? So the Chinese government is pushing a particular truth. The Russian government is pushing the fact that no truth even exists, and the only thing really is Vladimir Putin. And I think that is a major difference between how both countries look at content. But obviously, you know, Russia has been looking increasingly enviously at the Chinese ability to control the domestic online sphere. And so we've been seeing increasingly, as we also detail in the report, that Russian media regulators have been inviting Chinese regulators over and have started acquiring particular technologies to start doing similar things in Russia as are happening in China.
No, okay, no, I can see that there are differences. At the same time, the Russian population has, of course, a very long tradition and history of censorship. I mean, most of the notions around censorship have come from Russia. The rest of
well, no, and this is, you know, you're completely right, of course, and this is where I want to differentiate the point between post-1991 Russia and the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Post-1991, you're quite right. You mentioned it. Okay, Eric, would there be anything you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's very important to note the difference in political regime in China and Russia, and you might characterize Russia's political regime as authoritarian, but you might, on the other hand, characterize China's political regime as totalitarian. So they want different things, and that would also have implications with what is desirable in terms of online content regulation. So I think Russia still takes, well, of course, this is changing as in what previously Russia is trying to do with online content regulation isn't really working for them. So they're looking the Chinese way and taking a more rigid measure to regulate its online content. But I think in general, the general rule in Russia would still be what is not forbidden is allowed, and they rather forbid things ad hoc, instead of saying if you don't meet this and this and that criteria, then you cannot be accessed in a normal way on Russia's territory. So I think this is something that really should be noted, as in it doesn't only concern the possibility or the ability for the governments to regulate the internet. It's also about what they want. I wouldn't entirely agree that Russia pretends to be a democracy. I think that's mostly accurate way to define it. But I think we also shouldn't downplay the differences in regime between China and Russia.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. A last question before we go to the audience for Q&A. Notwithstanding your critical appraisal of the cyber activities of both Russia and China, your conclusion still is that some sort of cooperation, I think you even call it a grand cooperation, between the EU and these two not so likely allies should be preferred over a further going down to the road, on the road of confrontation. Now, how do you envisage that? And in this respect, do you think there is a different window of opportunities between the EU on the one hand and the United States on the other hand for avoiding the confrontation?
I'm not sure that there's a different window of opportunity, but there certainly are different geopolitical interests. The European Union shares a border with Russia and is dependent on Russia for quite a bit of its energy. The United, right? In contrast, we don't necessarily have a lot of geopolitical flashpoints with China, certainly not in comparison to the United States, right? The United States sees itself as an Asia-Pacific power, which most European countries certainly don't. Although the Brits have been starting to make noise in that direction again. What I mean with the point of cooperation is very simply this. I think we need to come to an acceptance, I think in the West generally, that our agenda that we had in the early 2000s with regard to technological freedom, right? This belief that we had that the rest of the world would become democratic, would become free market capitalist, and that technology would make it happen. You still see a lot of that, guiding policy, and I simply do not think it's a reasonable policy objective. We do not have the means to make this happen. And so the question is more, how do we develop a targeted foreign policy also in cyberspace that is actually within what we can achieve? Second, in the same way that China and Russia are necessary partners in combating other global issues like climate change, you're not going to make that happen if you do not have these two countries on board. You're also not going to have cybersecurity if you don't get these two countries on board, and that means that they're going to have some ownership of some of it, and that means that we as the West have to have some restraint. And perhaps I can sort of give a stupid example.
But stupid examples, yes, they're often the best. Go ahead. Yeah.
But a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft disclosed that its Microsoft Exchange email service software was hacked, and it attributed that to a Chinese hacking organization. Let's assume for a moment that that is an accurate assessment. The hack used 4 different vulnerabilities in code to exploit Microsoft Exchange. On the basis of remedial measures that Microsoft has taken, we can assume that those errors have been in Microsoft email server code for at least a decade. Now, intelligence and security services around the world tend to stockpile the vulnerabilities that they find in order to use them offensively. Right, look at the Stuxnet, which used, I can't remember exactly how many, but I think a combination of 6 or even 9 of these vulnerabilities in order to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. but the problem is that that is an increasingly risky strategy, right? Once upon a time, different countries would use different technology. So if you could hack into their technology, it would largely stay there. Now, all of us all use the same technology. So that means that we're all vulnerable. Yet intelligence and security services continue to prefer to privilege offense over defense. And so even though there is something in the US, they call it a vulnerabilities equities process that weighs whether these vulnerabilities should be disclosed to the vendors, the presumption is that they won't. And that means, it seems unlikely to me that the NSA or any of the ally services were unaware of these Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. That frankly, if the Chinese can discover them, and there's 4 of them, I think it's very likely that at least one of them would have been in Western hands, so to speak, but they were not disclosed, right? And this imperils all of us. This imperils all of the services we need, and right, these things can leak, but they can also escape, and they can continue to wreak havoc because systems administrators aren't necessarily very good at cyber hygiene either. I was talking to a colleague in France last week whose workplace has been hit by WannaCry, a cyber attack that started in 2017. So their systems still haven't been protected. So we're really dealing with a major systemic issue here, and I can't see any other scenario in which part of the solution is going to involve defense first by the leading powers in this field. That means disclosure of discovered vulnerabilities to vendors. That means restraint. That means, if I'm going to restrain myself, so my adversary needs to do so as well. And that seems to me the only way forward that doesn't make things worse than they are. And I think in a session that we did on COVID narratives about a year ago, I was already warning that the present feels a lot more like 1912, 1913 than I am comfortable with. And certainly the events of today, the Russian-Chinese meeting after the not very successful Chinese-American meeting, and the sanctions that have been sort of flying back and forth in recent days. We really have to consider what we want. Escalation, which can get out of control rapidly, or de-escalation, if that's possible. But that's going to mean that everyone is going to need to take a hit in their testosterone-driven whatever.
Yeah. And be willing to build on at least some trust, no matter how small the basis of that seems to be.
Exactly.
In certain instances.
And it's really where people get overconfident and they forget, even if things today are bad, you forget how rapidly they can get a lot worse.
Okay, thank you. Eric, you feel like adding something to this?
Yeah, sure. I think for effective policy engagement, especially for Europe, we need to know in which areas you can engage with China and Russia as separate actors, and in which areas that you cannot. I think it would be fair to say that China and Russia are de facto allies for example, in terms of international law, in cyberspace, in terms of they both prefer a state-centric multilateral governance model of the internet. But I think there are also two important areas actually that effective engagement separately with China and Russia would make a lot of sense. And the first one is, of course, the digital economy. And as we discussed before, because what Russia wants is a economic ecosystem, where itself is the great power, the dominant power. So probably that would include the Eurasian Economic Union. And China has a completely different agenda, and their agendas are overlapping in at least Central Asia. The other area, I think, effective engagement separately with China and Russia would make a lot of sense is in terms of, as Rogier also mentioned, code of conduct in cyberspace, in terms of cyber espionage and in terms of cyber covert actions. And I think this is also the area where we have the misperception that they are the bad guys and we are the good guys. And I think it's really this us versus them mentality that gives us this misperception. But in reality, it would, as in China and Russia also have their disagreements in terms of cyber espionage and covert cyber actions. You simply cannot treat them as allies in that regard. Lastly, I also think geopolitics nowadays plays a very important role, because the window of separate and effective engagement with China and Russia and de-escalation can be narrowing, as both Russia and China is facing a more hostile environment, at least from the West, then that would necessarily turn them closer towards each other. As we speak, the Russian foreign minister is actually in China, and I don't think this is entirely for domestic digestion or for advertisement. He says that China and Russia is at its best stage of bilateral relation in history. I think there is certain truth to that, and especially when both China and Russia is having a very difficult time with the US now.
Okay, thank you very much for this complimentary comment. Okay, now the questions are coming in and I will just deal with them as they come in. And I have to put on my reading glasses because they're long questions. Obviously, it's a very complicated topic that we are addressing here. Okay, good afternoon. One question from me. This is Pavlina Pavlova. Is Russia and China's involvement in Central Asia, particularly in regard to the export of information control and surveillance technologies, possibly damaging to the Central Asian countries' cyber defense in the long run? In more general terms, what is the cooperation/competition dynamics between Russia and China in the region? So I think this is something that Eric will first tackle. Eric, this is clearly a more geopolitical question. Could you help us with the answer?
I think we briefly mentioned that Russia has this sphere of influence mentality, right? And that really plays a role in virtually excluding Baltic states or post-Soviet states. And I think, I know this is probably political, but a very important question that should be asked is what those countries want instead of what Russia would prefer them to do in regards with cooperation with China. I don't think the Chinese, sorry, I'm just scrolling to the question. I don't think the majority of China's involvement in Central Asia is about the export of information control and surveillance technologies. I think in general, we tend to frame it as in China is exporting surveillance technologies and information control know-how. But I think it would make more sense to look at it in a different way, as in authoritarian government has the incentive to ask China for those kind of cooperation or exports or imports, to be fair. So to conclude, I think in terms of geopolitics, of course, there is this sphere of influence mentality. But I think currently, although there are concerns that China's engagement in Central Asia might chip away Russia's influence in Central Asia, I think it wouldn't be fair to say that there will be a confrontation between China and Russia's geo-economic interest in Central Asia in the foreseeable future. because China can provide a lot of things that Russia can't to Central Asian states. And I think even if Russia has the interest to counter Chinese influence, there wouldn't be alternatives that they can offer. And I think so far there are also quite a lot of experts in Russia that sees that sort of involvement in Central Asia by China and Russia as complementary.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you for that. There's a question to the domestic situation with respect to ICT in Russia. Has there been an improvement in Russia when you look at the domestic facilities on ICT with the help of China? And do you, both of you, I guess, think this would change the way that Russia uses cyberspace to reach their political agenda?
That's very much Eric's thing, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, about the interference with the elections that you mentioned. I mean, is it feasible that that quality of that interference will increase as a consequence of the cooperation with China? But let's first turn to Eric. Eric.
I think thinking on top of my head, there is at least two aspects. So I think if you have read our reports, there is an agreement by the Chinese Cyber Administration, between Chinese Cyber Administration and their Russian counterparts, Roskomnadzor, to basically borrow China's expertise in regulating unwanted information. So that would be one aspect of Russia, with the help of China, developing its technological capability. And in terms of a more economic perspective, I think it's still quite premature to evaluate what kind of impact this will already have on Russia's ICT and Russia's capability, because I think until for example, Huawei has only opened its first artificial intelligence center in Moscow in, I think, if I'm not wrong, 2017, 2018. So it hasn't been a long time, and actually, if we're talking about economic cooperation, economic engagement, economic investment into foreign countries, technology, well, you can say that China is more active in a lot of other countries than what's going on in Russia, but geopolitics might play a role, and as well, we mentioned, I think, several times already, that they might push them together, as they will find other alternatives, unsuitable partners. This might push China towards investing more into Russia, but that still hasn't happened yet.
Okay, clear. Nothing you would like to add, I guess?
No.
Okay, I'll turn to the next question by Mr. or Mrs. Hoffman. In your report, you mentioned that cybersecurity in the West is, well, I guess everybody can see these questions, can they? I should not be able to read them out. I should not, it's not necessary for me to read them out aloud, is it?
But I can't read them, so.
Yeah. You can't read them, okay. Just for the sake of keeping Rogier more or less connected in the discussion, yes, I will read out the next question. Yeah, because if we do it like this, we are offending the 1.5 meter rule, which will get us in prison, camps, whatever. Okay, in your report, you mentioned that cybersecurity in the West is more considered on a technological and infrastructure level security, whereas China and Russia's definition is more about information security. Do you think that this Western notion of cybersecurity might shift to this Chinese-Russian definition because of the increasing threat of cyber espionage in the world in the past few years?
It's already shifting.
It's already shifting.
It's already
Okay,
shifting.
good.
And we really see that. So just to sort of flesh it out, traditionally in the West, we looked at cybersecurity as something, this is about technology. This is about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of technological system in the data
user security.
User security, but also, making sure that the telephone system was still working and that, right, people have been talking a lot about the idea of a cyber Pearl Harbor, that suddenly, an adversary power could switch the lights off in New York, or open up all of the dams so that you get flooding, that sort of thing. But when you look at the harms that have actually come to us through cyberspace, very often they come from exploiting the ways that systems are designed to work. So if you look at the way that the Russians used Facebook in the 2016 election, this was exactly the way that Facebook was designed. They didn't destroy anything, right?
Made use of the possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah. So they just leveraged the way that the network economy works. And that is something that Russia, but certainly China, has been far more aware of for a far longer time. If I want to be a little bit controversial, and every so often that happens, I will say that China has had a far more correct assessment of what security challenges can actually emerge through technology. It was more correct than we were, and it was that a decade earlier. So in very many ways, it's actually running ahead of us. Right? We've been lazy in our ideas, and China hasn't. It actually thought these things through. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one has to agree with the answers that China has come up with. But what we're seeing today is, if the United States and India are banning apps like TikTok or limiting the use of WeChat, that's not because they form a threat to cybersecurity under the old definition, right? They do not imperil the confidentiality, integrity, availability of network systems and the data on them. But it's because we are moving more and more towards a similar approach to security in cyberspace as the one that China's embracing. We equally see this with the word sovereignty, right? This is no longer a dirty word in Brussels. EU officials and national European governments are increasingly talking about sovereignty when it comes to cyber affairs as well. So yeah, China has been a pace setter and a thought leader in this regard.
Okay, good. Well, definitely. We have 10 minutes more left, I think, and there are a few questions. So Eric, if there's nothing particular that you would like to add to this, I will just go on to the next question. Is that all okay with you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Here's from Liana Foschel. While I know that China and the US/EU often do not see eye to eye as to what priorities in cyberspace governance should be, does Russia have the same issue? I think we dealt with that more or less, but let's turn to the last part of the question. Or is this mediated by Russia's cultural and physical proximity to the West? Eric, that might be something for you, I guess.
I think it's less about cultural and physical proximity. It would be relevant to say that, although this is again my personal assessment, and this is probably controversial, but I think in terms of how politics and how political life, how public life is organized in Russia, Russia is more similar to the West than to China, and I think that does play a huge role in especially online content regulation, especially this. Well, they don't have the obsession with technological autarky, which I think is also, well, although to a lesser degree, relevant to priorities in governance in cyberspace.
No, okay, good, thank you. From our former colleague Vincent Brusse, what are the first areas in cyber policy where cooperation or de-escalation, which we talked about before, should be pursued, or where this is most feasible in the short term? And what is the current state of international cooperation in this field, for instance, through the UNGGs?
the standard state of cooperation is essentially zero. So when you look at the way that the internet functions, what we see very well is that the technical underpinnings of it, the addressing system, the internet protocol system, that is running fairly well. It's also fairly uncontroversial. But apart from that, when it actually comes to substantive issues, regulating the things that we actually do through these networks, we're not at any point where I think there's a critical mass in any area to move things forward, partially because this entire issue has become so symbolic for everyone that no one wants to be seen to compromise. And this is really risky. I mean, remember when ICANN was privatized a couple of years ago, a relatively benign process and something that is in line with the stated values of the United States. You already had Ted Cruz standing up in the Senate and saying that the internet control over the internet was being handed over to China. So we are at a point where in Beijing, in Moscow, in Brussels, and in Washington, there seems to be a very strong sense that compromise is surrender. This is why I was talking about that escalatory sort of the 1913 sort of feeling, because if no one steps back, everyone is going to escalate. No one will want to surrender at this point, because to surrender at this point is essentially to say, you found our weak spot. And if you press this, you know, we're going to roll over again and again and again. And no one wants to do this at this time.
At this time.
So even where there are areas where I believe you know, cooperation would be necessary or useful, and it can happen at really technical levels, like cooperation between national computer emergency response team in relation to sudden massive cyber attacks. There is simply no political will in any capital to get anything done at this time.
Two things come to mind. It's the Munich syndrome, Chamberlain, of course. And at the same time, the whole foreign policy stance of governments is very much connected with domestic cleavage, domestic polarization, etc., which doesn't make things more easy.
No, and this is something we see everywhere, right? China. To be against China is pretty much the only thing that flies across the entire political spectrum in the United States. And so there is very much a risk that you're going to use China for, you know, domestic political circumstances with all kinds of unintended consequences. Foreign policy is 10% you do what you want to get done, 90% of stuff just happens to you as an unintended consequence. This comes also, you know, to the point of big power, small power. If there's anything that history tells us, it is that we think big powers are powerful, and then they routinely get their backsides handed to them by small countries, you know, Afghanistan, Vietnam, North Korea to a certain degree, you name it. And so this is really the dynamic that we're facing, where there urgently needs to be some climb down. And because it's increasingly urgently necessary, it's becoming less and less possible.
Feasible. Yeah, okay, good. One comment, maybe one of you would like to react to that. Definitions are not accidental. It's about governance, model, and human rights.
Nothing is about human rights. Nothing is about, you know, so let me put it differently.
Now everything is about human rights.
No, there's a wonderful book out there, The Twilight of Human Rights Law, by the American legal researcher Posner, where he very nicely argues that no one has really taken human rights, no government has taken human rights seriously as an operating principle of international law after the Nuremberg trials. However, it's a very political thing because, you know, no one can claim to be against human rights. It's a very useful political thing to then get other things done. And this is
a cynical view, but not unrealistic, perhaps.
And this is the second point to it is that the way that we deal with human rights is very Western. There's another wonderful book out there. It's called Dominion by Tom Holland, where he argues that the entire world we've created around ourselves is essentially Christian, and he discusses human rights in the light of a theological history where humans are created in the light of God, and therefore, as the American Declaration of Independence has it, we are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that's really, a strong contribution to a human rights tradition that, China's never been a majority Christian country ever. No. So the whole idea of human rights, it's partly cynical political use, but it's also contingent as a cultural phenomenon, and it isn't because we believe that they are universal, that they are. Right? I would love to believe that the university should pay all of us 10 times more than what they're doing now, but that doesn't make it true. And this is really, human rights only become important if we live them out as governments. And this is really where I think the European Union and the United States have a massive role to play. Right? China, as an emerging power, is not listening to what Washington or Brussels say. It is looking at what they do. And it is asking itself, how do I get away with some of that? So if the United States arrogates to itself the power to shut down a nuclear power plant in the first kinetic cyber attack in history, or, very few people know this, but Huawei got hacked in 2010, massive hack by the NSA, to use Huawei to spy on, governments that had used Huawei telecommunications. And so China looks at this and goes, they have these capabilities. If this is how superpowers act, this is what we will do as well. And so the only way to make meaningful progress on human rights is to live them out consistently. But that also means closing Guantanamo Bay, for instance.
Well, Joe Biden was confronted with how difficult it is to stop practices already there in the border region where children are still being divided from their parents, taken away from their parents, obviously, apparently in larger numbers than under Trump. And I'm quite sure that's not something Biden is happy with. Okay, let's leave this alone. Let's turn to the last question also because we're running out of time. This is a question to access to Western markets. Is it possible? And if so, how can Chinese companies participate in more sovereignty-oriented Western markets?
I'm not sure they can. The whole point, sovereignty goes both ways. And there's a really interesting example that goes to the heart of that, which is that a couple of weeks ago, the British broadcast regulator Ofcom essentially took the Chinese television station CGTN offline for not abiding by British broadcasting laws, which require a certain degree of political neutrality or political balance, and so on, or non-partisan connectedness. And that is pretty much obviously, the Hong Kong. The Hong Kong problem is very much a thing between the UK and China, and the UK is trying to position itself as a sort of new and independent global actor post-Brexit. But at the heart of the matter, the point is that Britain has the right to regulate its domestic broadcast market because it's a sovereign state. And that means that under the rules that the British government has adopted as a sovereign state, there's no place for CGTN. And the Chinese government can protest about that, but it can't do anything about it because this is what sovereignty entails. And so the consequence of that automatically is, we can agree as sovereign states on rules that we will both follow, but that means that you automatically lose space for action. And this is the point. You can't have it all. Everything is a trade-off. Everything comes with a cost. Everything comes with a price attached. And until all the capitals involved understand that, we're not going to do anything meaningful about what I think is over-optimism or certainly overestimation on all sides. And we're just going to see the current crisis continue.
Well, these are sobering up words, I should say. Eric, is there any other line that you would like to end this discussion?
No, actually not. Okay. Good question.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much both for your involvement, for the paper you wrote, the report you wrote, and the way in which you handled the discussion. I think a lot more issues than just Russian Sino cyber relations were being dealt with, and I hope that you enjoyed it and that you. Well, that you took a lot from it and learned, and maybe also have become more interested in these issues. There are a number of Sino-Cyber reports on the website. We also have reports about the Digital Silk Road in India, and upcoming we have the Digital Silk Road in Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Iran, and these will be published in the course of April. So if you are interested in this issue, stay tuned in with the Leiden Asia Center, and we hope to serve you in the near future more. Thank you very much, both Eric. Hope to see you soon again in the office one of these days, and also Rogier. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for being with us, and we'd like to see you again in the near future. Many thanks.